Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and good evening from Philadelphia. And welcome to the last History of Material Text workshop for the fall 2021 semester. It's hard to believe I'm saying that. I'm John Pollock. You got to know who I am by now. I am one of the co-organizers of this seminar, along with Zach Lesser in the English department, who's a few feet away in the room, and our colleague emeritus from Penn Press, Jerry Singerman. Jerry is in climes far away, and I am not sure whether he's able to join us remotely tonight or not, several time zones away. So I think I just wanted to start very quickly before we turn to Ellen, which is the reason you're here, is to say at the end of this long and challenging semester to kind of actually send out a thank you to all the members of this seminar. I consider us all members, whether you are on Zoom or in person, whether you attended one session or all of them or somewhere in between. All of us really appreciate your interest and support, and we hope you stay engaged and feel welcome to engage with us to share your thoughts about the workshop. For in-person folks, our spectacular manager and Bristol Schoenberg Fellow, Eileen Malcolm, will send around a sign-in sheet. For you virtual folks, make sure to stay on our listserv, check out penmaterialtexts.org if you need to sign up. And we really do mean seriously that if you have questions, suggestions, or other feedback, we welcome it. Our spring semester will start on January 24th, and our speaker will be Pamela Smith of Columbia. So we're looking forward to that. Last week, for those of you who were with us virtually last week, we plunged into some important and innovative questions being asked about lost books in the early modern period. And I think it suggests the richness of our subject, material texts, that is, that tonight what we're going to hear is just as important and just as innovative, but from a scholar who focuses on a very different time and place. So we are really delighted to welcome Ellen Gruber Garvey, one of the longest friends and supporters of this seminar. Ellen is actually a Penn product. Her advisor, rumor has it, is in the room tonight. And her PhD was on American magazines, fiction, and advertising in the late 19th century. That became a prize-winning book called The Ad Man in the Parlor, Magazines and the Gendering of Consumer Culture, 1880s to 1910s, from Oxford. She is, as you can tell from that, a specialist on advertising and the place of books in the new worlds of the commercial mass media in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That book, The Ad Man in the Parlor, won the DeLong Prize from Sharp for the best publication in book history that year. It is perhaps the case, though, that many of us got to know Ellen when she was working on her next project, which was published in 2013, and I still believe this is one of the catchiest academic titles of all time, Writing with Scissors, American Scrapbooks from the Civil War to the Harlem Renaissance, also from Oxford and also a multiple prize winner. She presented this project, our digital memory tells us, to this seminar back around 2006. Hopefully that's more or less when that happened. So as I was saying, I think we and many librarians remember getting to know Ellen as the scrapbook person, or maybe that scrapbook person. She must have gone to hundreds of institutions, big and small, and seen who knows how many scrapbooks. I will let you all in on a little secret. Librarians don't really like scrapbooks. They find them clunky, messy, ungainly, hard to carry, hard to describe, hard to catalog. They're full of bits that tend to fall out. And some of us really might prefer if they just went away. Not this librarian, of course. But Ellen, what Ellen did is really made the case, as no one, I think, before her had, that these too often neglected things were crucial to cultural history and to book history. I just wanted to read a couple of lines from the introduction to Writing with Scissors. Ellen studies, she writes, not only the scrapbooks of public figures, but also how people in positions of relative powerlessness use their scrapbooks to make a place for themselves and their communities by finding, sifting, analyzing, and recirculating writing that mattered to them. Such scrapbooks, she writes, open a window into the lives and thoughts of people who did not respond to their world with their own writing. These are powerful ideas, and for me, critical ones for our discipline of book history. Ellen persuasively shows how the study of a genre or a format, the quirky scrapbook, can open up some of the biggest and most crucial questions about cultural history and about the sociology of texts. Tonight, we're going to hear about Back Number Bud, a remarkable character who had a cameo in Writing with Scissors, but is now starring in his own miniseries. Her talk is entitled Unstable Access to the Print Record, the case of Back Number Bud and 19th century newspapers. Welcome, Ellen, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm and generous introduction. How do we get to
And now we're going to share a screen.
Share screen. Okay. So I ran into Back Number Bud when I was working on scrapbooks. And I think that his story is more than ever necessary to be told in our world of COVID lockdown. Even as we emerge from COVID lockdown, it's been derailing and disorienting for scholarly research. Our archives have been closed or restricted, or we couldn't travel to them. And even so, with our informational infrastructure of WorldCat, Archive Grid, and the many publications that have been digitized, now we have some idea where to look. If, for example, we wanted to find a newspaper from 1875, we take it for granted that old newspapers and magazines are worth looking at, that they hold information we need. And I'd guess that at least out of this semester's material texts presentations, at least about 6 of them drew on old periodicals. We searched them to find specific articles or to notice trends in a term, how it's trended over the years. Use them lots and lots of different ways as data sets. I'm thinking of particularly of Ryan Cordell's viral text project, Ryan has looked at the phenomenon of exchanges of newspapers in the 19th century and noticed who exchanged with whom. And it isn't that they all took from the New York Times or the Tribune. People in Ohio particularly, liked somebody else in Ohio because it was somebody's brother-in-law. I mean, he finds amazing things, and it's because he can look at many, many newspapers at once. The possibility of searching old newspapers digitally has emerged relatively quickly. I'm sorry, and it looks like an atom, but you can actually see those little arcs are connecting different things. This possibility of searching many newspapers digitally has emerged relatively quickly. It builds on existing collections of old newspapers, which are often incomplete. The fact that they exist at all and that they're incomplete has roots in the conflicting ways that newspapers have been regarded in the past. The idea that old newspapers had value was rarely a given. In the 19th century, United States newspapers became cheaper to buy. They proliferated. They moved faster, conveyed news brought to them by telegraph. They were rapidly distributed through cities and rural areas. They brought the news of the day, soon displaced by the news from a later edition, and then the next day. But old newspapers, fish wrapping, trunk linings, poor people's wallpaper, pulp to make paper mache or new paper. As one person who was actually very much involved in old newspapers in a way, wrote, Frank Burrell said in 1896, the life of a newspaper is shorter than a butterfly's. The products of 100 human brains are by a wonderful process conveyed to the printed sheet, which a few hours later will be used to light a fire. Burrell was one figure who found a way to profit from this situation, and a little more about his approach later. But why weren't more newspapers saved from ephemerality? Newspapers are bulky. They're used intensively for a short time and then less and less. Institutions lacked storage space. Individual newspaper publishers generally kept files of their own paper intended for internal use, sometimes in bound volumes, and they clipped others for their newspaper morgues or internal research resources. One of the articles out there on the table from The Clipping Collector, published by Frank Burrell, is about newspaper morgues, if you want to take a look at it. Although 19th century newspapers might receive hundreds of other newspapers via their exchange system, these were intended for immediate use, as you can see here on the left. That's a picture, it's a detail from a newspaper, an article about rural newspapers and how they get paid, but you can see the exchange editor has been clipping away, and these are all little shredded clippings that will then go in the wastebasket, or this large scissored man working with the siftings above him also. But realize too, not only are they moving as texts from one newspaper to another, but the rest of the newspaper is discarded. It's only useful for that clipping. So, institutions that gathered multiple newspapers needed a structuring rationale for what to save or keep. Barbershops and hotel lobbies gathered local dailies for the use of their clients and got rid of them in a day or two. They didn't need them. They sold them by the pound to get pulp to make more paper. This is especially true before wood pulp paper came in, but newspapers too were made from rags, and they could easily be recycled into new paper. Reading rooms that subscribed to large numbers of papers, like the Merchants Exchange. Whoops, this is not working. There we go. Is it okay? Like the Merchants Exchange reading room this is a picture from 1863, disposed of their papers after a few months. And as you can see also, this is a very homogeneous group reading in the Merchants Exchange. It's all white men. That's because it's part of the stock exchange, which was quite expensive to join. So even though they had an extraordinary number of newspapers, that was very limited even to read them for that news of the day. Another business emerged that also stored newspapers. That was advertising agencies who boasted about the thousands of newspapers that they received from around the country. And they had to demonstrate that they actually could keep track and tell you if your ad ran, because advertising agencies were not exactly regarded as particularly above board enterprises. So George Rowell in New York first began doing this with having these immense numbers of newspapers, and showed off about how well organized he was and how he could show you where your ad was, as Richard Popp has discovered. But once they checked off the presence of the ad, they disposed of the papers for pulp a few days or months later. And I love this picture because it looks so much like, burglars in the night stuffing the newspapers to be pulped into this great sack to be gotten rid of. And a few used bookstores did occasionally sell newspapers, or usually bound volumes. But in the early 1880s, if you were an ordinary person or a newspaper reporter or a scholar who wanted to find an old newspaper or an article for one, you were stymied, unless, starting in 1882, you had been walking around New York City's Tenderloin district, the neighborhood of theaters and hotels on Broadway in the 30s. And perhaps then you would have spotted a sign at the top of the stairs leading down to a basement. A few years later, you might have come across one of a dozen newspaper articles mentioning this business or seen one of the ads that mentioned it. Then you would know about back number Bud. The earliest article about his store from 1885 lays out the problem his business solved. Having occasion the other day to search for some copies of daily newspapers of a certain date in 1875, I was not surprised that at the offices of the newspapers I could find no copies. Not one of the great dailies could furnish a copy of the date which I needed, but I was referred in every case to a man named Robert Budd, formerly a bootblack, who made a business of dealing in back numbers of newspapers. I found him, and in half an hour, I had the papers. Back number Bud redefined old newspapers. They weren't just old paper to light a fire or turn into fish wrapping, or even to check for advertising insertions and then pulp, but rather a vehicle for information and history to access and organize. Bud's redefinition was a crucial step in understanding that using newspapers as a source of data and history. He saved and made newspapers available. In some ways, he was like an archivist. You archivists can argue with me about that. Archivists can't assume they know how people will use the documents they collect. Their roles include acquiring, sorting, and cataloging materials so they'll be usable. The fact that Bud sorted the newspapers by date, place of publication, and title made them usable to people who we might now call researchers. The surprise that reporters express at how quickly he could find a particular issue suggests that his sorting system was an innovation. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Bud's career weaves through the movement of print through the 19th and early 20th century, making old newspapers available. How did he even think about this? How did he even think of this, doing this? He was born in 1851 in Washington, D.C. to free parents, and I know that because of work that by Reginald Pitts, who's been incredibly helpful in finding out about Bud's early history. And he was born to free parents. His mother was literate. He went to school, but his schooling was probably cut short when the Civil War started. And he started selling newspapers in the camp near Washington, in the battle camps near Washington, where soldiers were eager for the news. This is from Harper's Weekly triptych, much larger piece, but this is a detail of the soldiers reading. Of course, they're reading Harper's Weekly in this little bit, but still, he would ride out to the camps. He would take fresh papers to sell. Soldiers were bored in camp, and he would sometimes hitch on the rides on the wagons used to collect the dead. Newspapers at the time sold for a penny or 3 cents or 4 cents, but several weeks after the Battle of Bull Run, soldiers offered him an extravagant $3 each for the remaining copies he had of newspapers describing the battles they'd been in. And that's where his idea came from. People might pay more for old newspapers than new ones. He had a regular newsstand for a while in Philadelphia. And this you can see here, it says he kept a newsstand on Broad Street below Chestnut. And he lived in Philadelphia during the Centennial Exposition of 1876. So we can be fairly sure he attended it because he later reprinted copies of a souvenir old newspaper that was on sale there. And so it's very likely that he saw George Rowell's newspaper pavilion, where Rowell, who had also had that other setup in New York of checking the ads, here set up this beautiful pavilion to glorify newspapers around the country. People would stop in from the fair and look for their own small town paper in these splendid surroundings. So again, this is something that probably inspired Bud. He doesn't mention it, but it's a good bet. And you can see on the lower level, there's again that organizing system for newspapers that's quite visible. And this is also from Richard Popp's work. The pavilion showed off Rowell's system for sorting the newspapers that he gathered to check. So this was the same system he used in Newspaper Row in New York. By 1880, Bud had moved to New York City, but not Newspaper Row. By 1882, he'd opened a newspaper and shoe shine stand in what's now Greeley Square, near Herald Square, an area of Manhattan, in the West 30s. He soon added old newspapers to the stock of new ones, of current ones, though he continued selling current newspapers, and that way he could keep the old unsold daily papers and add them to his back stock. So he's around this area. I'm still looking for photos of he moved around a lot, as I'll explain in a bit. And I would love to find a photo of his shop front, but each time I get close to that address in a photograph, it's after he moved or before he was there. It's very frustrating. Roughly, this is where he was. When he got there in 1882, it was the Tenderloin, full of hotels and brothels and gambling houses and theaters. It's called Tenderloin because when the new police commissioner for that district came in, he said, "Ooh, now I can eat tenderloin. The bribes are so much better here." So the important piece of this for Bud's story is that rents were cheap and the hotels had newspaper readers. Bud bought old and leftover newspapers from the hotel's cleaning staffs, probably by the pound, as they would have been sold for pulp. So there are all these hotel lobbies, and they can see in the very background, they have newspaper stands, and this one's a little more obvious. He placed himself also in a world that was starting to understand periodicals as valuable sources too, by swapping and buying periodicals from libraries around the country, which either wrote to him because he also placed ads in some of the trade journals of book dealers and stationery and newsstand dealers, and there were wants lists in some of the newspapers and magazines. So he corresponded with institutions like the American Antiquarian Society, in this case, seeking to buy and sell stock. Send me at once numbers, long list of the nation, which I guess they had advertised that they wanted, that they were selling. They had duplicates. And then he offers others. His other methods, and there's another one, the American Antiquarian Society too. That one's harder to read because it's written in pencil, but you also get to see his wonderful stationery at the top there. Yeah. And he had other less conventional methods for acquiring stock. And archivists and librarians may want to try these. He wagered for runs of magazines and newspapers in taking bets on elections. He contracted with clubs to buy their daily newspapers by the month. And he traded and bartered using other forms of paper. So he has an ad somewhere offering 70,000 envelopes addressed to the lady of the house for files of any New York papers. Some newspapers recognized that he provided them with free offsite storage and they sent him free subscriptions, but others were less far-seeing and they put him on their deadhead list, the delinquent subscribers who hadn't paid. Eventually, he stocked between 4 and 8 million copies. So he's up, 2 million in the first one in white here. And then you can see he's up to over 4 million and he's up to over 6 million in the one on the back. And he, as you can see, he counts to the last copy, which is to say he could keep track. He's showing off about that, but it's also genuine, or seems to be. He was quite meticulous. So this bookkeeping system let him audit these holdings so that he was keenly aware when he was down to a single copy and he could advertise for more of them. He even also sort of reprinted them. I mean, they aren't facsimiles, but he did some work in that regard of popular items. So he's also, and because people sometimes came just to look at his papers and read them on premises, that meant that having a single copy was valuable to him too. People could come and read it. So he's a kind of archivist in that sense. In the 1880s, mid-1880s, he bought a warehouse in Ravenswood, Queens. You can see that in the addresses here, where he lived, and then he eventually just moved he moved the entire business there. Besides the chronological reach of his collection, another difference between it and a reading room like the Merchants Exchange was the breadth of it. His collection was vastly inclusive. He had the amusement bulletin, the black paper, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the cheap story paper, the Fireside Companion. But they were not likely to be in the stacks of any of those more august institutions. He also carried the Stadtzeitung, the French Courrier, and the Irish World. Again, probably not so widely available in those places. But how did people learn about him? How did they know to go to him? Well, he worked very long hours, keeping the newsstand open from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m, 7 days a week. So if you were heading to the theater or home from it, you might notice his display of old newspapers at the top of the staircase leading to his basement. Civil War papers on display attracted veterans at the top of it, and then they would come down. And what appears to be that first article that I quoted, I'm sorry, the article I quoted from before was probably the first article about his business. It's in Gossip from Gotham in the San Francisco Evening Bulletin. It was reprinted widely, as all these articles often were. And then the next article appeared a few months later in the New York World. And other articles on his business followed. His name became recognizable enough that news stories about his domestic troubles eventually started appearing, as well as on ones about an altercation he was in 1887. And they were printed all over the country. Now, to some extent, that's because he had this interesting, catchy name. But it also speaks to the fact that it was easier for reporters to slot a Black man into a narrative where he appears as a criminal rather than as an entrepreneur. And he became more deliberate in advertising his business. He made his name advertise his work. So although the 1885 reporter called him Robert Budd, in every subsequent report, he's called back number Budd. And he signed correspondence with that name, as you can see at the bottom there. And he also said he signed checks that way. And he also said that mail addressed to him just by that name, without an address, would reach him. So when he won newspaper, and all of these stunts, like winning newspapers by betting on them, also got him into the paper. And I just want to make a side note on his name. Racist newspaper writing conventions of the time meant that white men were referred to as Mr. Smith, say, after the first mention of the full name. But honorifics were rarely used for Black people. I'm following 21st century academic convention by calling him Bud. But maybe I shouldn't. He may have appreciated that the catchy name back number Bud made it more likely that reporters would use the full name, that full name, rather than just Bud without a handle. He cultivated publicity. He talked at length with reporters who might originally have come to buy papers from him, but then wrote about him. Newspaper reporters were flattered by the value that he attached to their work as reporters. So a New York World reporter exulted in 1886 that Bud's records indicate something of the wonderful growth of the New York World within the past 4 years. Look, now he sells 5,000 a week, as nearly twice as many as any other paper on his list. And magazines advertised that he collected them as that's how I know he carried the amusement bulletin, because they valued his illustrations, they said. And Bud understood the publicity value of these articles, and so he reprinted them on the back of his stationery. So a newspaper reader might hear of him when stories about large sums that had been offered for runs of his paper also appeared. There was one story made the rounds that was about, he had been offered $10,000 to complete a file of 2 years of the Leavenworth Journal from the time of bloody Kansas. But on behalf of the Kansas Historical Society, that Historical Society has no record of this sale, but many newspapers reprinted it, and that got him some publicity too. When Ulysses S. Grant bought papers from him, oddly, that somehow that made its way out to the newspapers and got publicized as well. People speculated, was it for his memoirs? And whenever there was another celebrity purchase, he got that got into the paper. So he cultivated newspaper reporters. He showed off highlights of his collection to them, teaching them about journalism history. So he owned Southern newspapers printed on wallpaper toward the end of the Civil War. This isn't his, but one at the Antiquarian Society. That's what they looked like. And it was a way of again, showing newspaper reporters how important their work was as a historical record. The sign for his business, advertising that he had runs of newspapers dating to 1833, is also about newspaper history. That's the first issue of the New York Sun, which was New York's first penny paper. His newspapers were not only paper information and historical documents, but became a topic to be treated as information and themselves. He thereby further dignified the reporters, and he also made their trade press available to them. He stocked the journalist, and he stocked news dealer and stationer. So again, bringing those same people in. And he had other unusual ways of advertising his business and getting noticed. If you were looking somebody up in the 1897 city directory on the 19th century equivalent of the phone book, you remember those, right? If you missed his display ad, your eye might catch on just on his name, his list of buds. Now take a look at the buds. The top of the column has back number bud here, back number bud and Sons news dealers, but skip on down and you've got Reason M. So these are all buds, Reason M bud, Richardson bud, Robert M. News, and they're all news dealers, right? With the same address, Robert M. Jr. News. Well, okay, Robert M. Back number Bud and Sons, that makes sense. Reason M. Bud, by the way, was 3 years old when this ad appeared. So, so he figured out that he could get extra lines in the city directory this way. And he does something, there's another city directory ad where he goes on and on about his business, and nobody else does that except in the space ads. So he's outside of the ordinary world of, in some ways, he's he can work around that. He's not restricted by some of the conventional ways of doing things. His bread, so he sometimes got attention for his celebrity clients, but his bread and butter clients were reporters, as I've mentioned, but also lawyers who needed the physical evidence of an item had been published on a specific date. And the value of his work was reflected in the price. When a reporter who sought articles from a few months earlier, was unable to find them in a library, he was directed to Bud. Bud located them easily and then shocked him by charging 10 times their original price. Bud's pricing scale, which systematically charged higher prices for older papers, threw some clients into category confusion. How could a paper that had cost a penny new cost 5 cents a month later, or $1 in a year, when it had become trash everywhere else? How could something that could be kindling a fire instead be valuable? One reporter who visited Bud's shop noted that it frequently happens that persons come to purchase papers several years old and expect to get them at face value. When they learn of the advanced price, it is amusing to hear them threaten to complain to the publisher and write to the editor and do other dreadful things. But as a general rule, they end by paying Bud's prices, as they know they cannot procure them elsewhere. Soon, the Herald and the Tribune moved to the area he was in, and that brought more reporters to him. That building in the back with the arches is the Herald building with the Minerva owls on it. It's not there anymore. But more reporters in the area was also a sign it was becoming more genteel. Macy's moved in not long after that, and the rents went up, as you might expect. Bud had to move frequently, and how he moved those millions of newspapers, I have no idea. Some of the addresses are actually adjoining each other behind the back. If you check the addresses, they're on the same block, and he probably hauled them across the yard. But otherwise, it's really hard to imagine. But by then he had most of his stuff in, whoops, there it is, in his shop in Ravenswood. So he had, the bulk of his stock was there, and he would, whoops, sorry, he would come back. Somebody would order something at the shop in Midtown, and he would go across and get it the next day. That's the only picture I've found of his shop front. Really excited to find it, hopping up and down on Sunday. So the reporters often framed that, but the fact that he was over in Ravenswood and had only these little, top of the stairs peepholes and moved so much meant that one of the things the reporters are always saying is that he's gone out of business. So as early as 1888, they're saying he's out of business and dead. And then somebody else comes out with another article, but that's a constant theme in these articles. And reporters often frame their anecdotes of the high prices that Bud received as a story of Bud creating riches from waste, almost by chance. He has a business that grows while he sleeps and grew from almost nothing, one asserted. And this question of whether what he was selling was waste or valuable was also connected to his position as a Black man, in a position that, in a period that disparaged Black work. On the one hand, the reporters were flattered by his attention to newspapers and the value he attached to their work. On the other hand, their racism made them cast him as a kind of lucky simpleton, making money by accident. In addition to the value that Bud contributed by storing bulky, vulnerable materials, his prices reflected the value added in the system that he'd created to organize these stacks and bundles. And again, the only picture of his organization system. But he describes it as being organized like a calendar, a simple system of my own. All the papers of a given date are arranged in bundles according to states and localities, with a separate tag on each bundle. In this way, either my men or I can put our hands upon any papers we want inside a minute or two. But his systems and explanations did not stop clients from seeing his work as some kind of a trick or a cheat. He heard the complaints so often that he put out a booklet arguing back, where he said he'd been accused of running a trust or a swindle. A monopoly. Was it because he was Black that people thought of his business as somehow magic or a trust, not following the usual path where things lose value as they age? He sought to make his materials even more valuable in a way that he actually had discussed with the 1885 San Francisco reporter. In 1888, he learned of Poole's index to periodicals. Some of you have probably used it over the years. Who knew it actually has an author, William Frederick Poole, then the head librarian at the Newberry in Chicago. And he wrote to him hoping to barter newspapers for his index. Bud was not part of genteel social circles or conventional scholarly circuits that would have brought him information about this index. But he seized on what he'd learned from meeting Poole's son in a class at the YMCA. He says, I make many trades with the YMCA and the other libraries. And although he has not the cash money to send, he hopes they can trade. And he can be of use to Poole, as I have to many libraries. And there's no record of a reply. One 19th century Black historian and scrapbook maker extraordinaire, William Dorsey of Philadelphia, corresponded with Bud, and he saved articles about him from the Black press. While white news reporters usually saw him as a curiosity, for the Black newspapers, he offered lessons in successful striving, a rags to riches life. This article in the Indiana Freeman, a national colored weekly newspaper, is from a run of papers that's been, many of the papers have been digitized, but not this article, not this issue. The only way we have it is because William Dorsey saved it. So that long record of neglect is reflected over and over again in what's available to us now. Bud's life did not, despite this idea of the rags to riches life, his life did not end in riches. He suffered 2 fires at the Queen's Warehouse, one in 1895, which he pretty well recovered from, and the second entirely devastating in 1922 when most of his papers burned. But by then, he no longer had a location in Manhattan at all near reporters, and most of them assumed he was already out of business. They no longer depended on him. This picture appeared in one of the last articles about him in a black newspaper. I think it's in the Amsterdam News, I think. After his second fire, when he was back to selling shoelaces as well as newspapers and odds and ends of printed matter. One of the last records of him in articles about him also says he's arrested for selling fireworks. So he was moved into various odds and ends there. The sign, of course, is from his heyday in the 1890s. Before the 1922 fire, his business card proclaimed that he had 6,200,000 odd copies on hand. 70-year-old Bud rushed back into the fire, hoping to save some of the papers. But by 1922, other resources had opened up. Beginning in the 1890s, clipping bureaus like Frank Burrell's served clients who mainly contracted to have the current day's papers searched for chosen search terms. This allowed clients to cast a wide net through many newspapers for their interests, but it focused on the papers of the day. So Burrell advertised that he kept runs of the New York dailies, presumably indefinitely, which clients could pay to have searched. And there's an article about that in one of those newspapers on one of those magazines on the table. But the price of doing a retrospective search was immense. And it was so high that he mentioned that one search was underway and asked if anybody else wanted to join in. They could get it a little cheaper while they were searching through those papers. The offer was not popular. But soon, reporters were more likely to dig for background for their articles at the New York Public Library's 42nd Street, which opened in 1911 with a bright new reading room for dailies and weeklies and storage. They got saved, reflecting a new understanding that news of the day had historical value. In the 21st century, we're confident that we can find a news item we've seen, no matter what form it was in. Even as it flickers away from the present moment, it's all searchable, whether it reached us on a smartphone, a Twitter feed, or as TV news in the airport, forwarded in an email or a friend's Facebook post. In the 19th century, Backnumber Bud understood that he was saving and storing information in historical records. His sorting system allowed readers to access newspapers and use them either online or buy a copy to use at home or at work. Backnumber Bud's understanding undergirds our present day use of news and information. When he pioneered in accomplishing what he said was what no other dealer in the world ever attempted, as he laid the groundwork for the media world we inhabit now. His papers, on the other hand, have all vanished. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Back to the front here, not that we have a huge crowd in the room. Why don't we let you see your Zoom, confront your Zoom audience here. Great.
Okay.
And Zach, start us out.
Yeah, that was great. That was so fascinating and really interesting the way you connect his story to the kind of theoretical or conceptual issue of what's the worth of old newspapers. And I was really struck by that article that said, talks about people being befuddled by the idea that they would not pay what's on the price. And this is, I think it was 1890s. It's interesting because, in my field, in Shakespeare studies, I mean, that is the absolute peak of antiquarian book collecting mania for Shakespeare stuff, right? So you have Folger, Huntington, other people paying exorbitant prices for old books. So is anyone collecting, like in the antiquarian market, is there anyone collecting old newspapers? Or is it just that thinking that way for newspapers is so alien compared to books? I mean, even I'm trying to think in England about big newspaper collections. There must have been there are big runs of Victorian newspapers, so I don't actually know how to use those, but I don't know how they came to be. And one of the things I also think your talk really highlights is the importance of understanding the prehistory of the material that we use often without thinking about it.
Thank you for that question. I'll repeat a bit of it because I know as being a longtime Zoom audience member, it can be very hard to hear the questions in the room. Zach made the comparison to what was going on in the antiquarian book market, and especially in Shakespeare, with the buying and selling of rare items, which are valued by age, and that's starting to happen in the 1880s, 1890s. And here, this is quite the opposite, where age is an index of nothing. I mean, that it should be trash by then. And also brought up large collections of newspapers in England, in Great Britain. I don't know about the British, and that's very interesting. I mean, as you know from probably, if you've read Nicholson Baker's Double Fold, there was a real eagerness to get rid of newspapers, especially by the early to mid 20th century, just because of massiveness and bulk and spurious claims that they were really brittle and wasting away, even in bound volumes. I don't know about that. Well, as I say, I don't know about the British part, but I think there were already collectors of 18th century newspapers, because that's why Budd does this little trick. He acquires there was a reprint, a souvenir made at the Philadelphia Centennial of a sort of reprint. It doesn't look, it's not a facsimile. It doesn't really look anything like the newspaper of the Ulster County Gazette. And I think that's the one with Washington's inauguration. And then there's another one of his death with the rules turned. And he gets hold of that and reprints it with his ad on it. But I mean, he gets hold of the plates, that is, so a decade later, and starts doing that. So there is an interest in them as a kind of, in some kinds of them, of old newspapers. And then the reason you can find out more about this is because it shows up. There are lists of what to avoid when collecting old newspapers, and they say, no, this is a fake. Don't buy the back number Budd version. So there is some interest in it by then, by some point in the early 20th century. Yeah.
And was this it's almost like surge pricing, right? When like an Uber system where the more valuable it is, I'm guessing the more you charge, right?
Yes.
And was the attractiveness of his operation in part because it was like a one-stop shop place? Like you could go, presumably the Herald would have its own archive. I'm not sure if it was open to the public.
Wouldn't be.
But they're probably, I mean, if the journalists themselves, they would have access to their own archives.
Yeah, they start creating, and the newspaper morgue starts to be a practice, but that is not of intact periodical. So the question was, isn't this sort of surge pricing where items are charged, or people charge, Budd charges more for items that are more rare or that are more in demand, and he sees it as more in demand rather than more rare. And if they're more in demand, then he sends out more letters and tries to find more of them. And then he says something about reprinting them as well. One of his sons is listed in the census as a printer for a little while, and I think he had some kind of,
Yeah,
I don't know.
Reprinting is certainly something I'm curious about. I mean,
Well, they aren't. I mean, that's curious because the thing that he does, that the reprint that he does of the Ulster County Gazette isn't remotely a reprint. I mean, it's just a sort of a,
But it indicates that it may be that what he's selling and what people want is the text. There's no other way to know what was said.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the document itself necessarily,
Right.
or the look of it. It's simply knowing
The information, yeah.
except the lawyers who want the actual document because they
Mhm.
need to bring it to court and they say, you know, this guy died this day. Look, I have the, you know, the obituary. Or this patent was, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So anyway, to get back to that surge pricing idea of the more demand, there was another part of your question.
Oh, I would just ask him that because he had multiple papers, did that make this?
Oh, yeah, one-stop shop. Okay.
Attractive?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the newspapers, as that one San Francisco reporter says, he went to the different newspapers and they couldn't give it to him. And whether they wouldn't even let them read it there, I don't know. But morgues cut up the paper. And in fact, they had an elaborate filing system of putting things into envelopes so you could find things quickly. And there's a wonderful, by the way, there's a wonderful film called Obit about the New York Times the New York Times morgue and their obituary department.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's something key. He's keeping whole papers and that makes him exceptional, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there again, every once in a while, there's an
In a
ad.
world of scissorsers.
Exactly, yeah, because he's not selling the chopped up ones. He's selling the whole one. Now, I don't know how he dealt with the fact that there were multiple editions that could be quite different, that the city edition and the national
Yeah.
edition turn out to have very
How thorough
different
was his-
materials.
Yeah.
Uh,
And reprints.
And reprints, yeah. Should we take a question from the chat and then Laura?
I think there's a chat question that was DM'd to you, so I can't actually read it.
Oh. Okay, let's see here. Can you scroll through this? Do you have special methods to protect the papers in storage from Fran?
Okay, I do not know if he had special methods
Yeah.
to protect the papers. I mean, what we saw in that item, he says actually at one point, he thinks that his papers are fireproof because they're packed so tightly. And in fact, I mean, there's a certain truth to that. It's harder to set something afire, you know, if it's very tightly packed,
yeah.
and if it's if you're not going from if you have a paper rolled up and you're going from the binding edge, it would be harder to set it alight than if it's going, but he's not really taking into account that once the heat gets going, the whole thing goes. Also, his son in the 1922 fire, his son kept his motorcycle next to the next to the barn. But it's also possible that it was arson. He had some significant conflicts with his neighbors. So there's some possibility there.
Just a reminder that you're all welcome to folks on Zoom to use the raise hand function in the reactions menu if you want to put your hand up and we'll call on you. But let's turn to Laura. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for this process. It's really fun. I wanted to follow up on John's point about the fact that back in Rebut is saving full papers, right? And what kind of value that gives them that's different from what happens. I think there's a chronological argument here about the clipping as rising in importance as a bit of information. Presumably, from the organizational system you described, people come in and they're looking for, they start with a date, right? He organizes by date and then by geography. So they can't come in asking about a topic or a subject unless
Right.
it's tied to a significant date or a battle or something known important. That seems that that's different, right? And I think the value of the clipping kind of reaches its peak in the late 19th century with the clipping bureau certainly, but also in libraries, the rise of the vertical file, which becomes common practice and is organized by topic. And so the ability to kind of reach into the paper and get that bit of data becomes crucial. So I'm curious about, they put him out of business maybe on some level, but isn't the kind of value that he's deserving somewhat different? I'm curious if you would have thought on like what's the archetypal value that's different from data.
That's a lovely question. Okay, so how is an archive, unless, I don't know, are you typing it in? Okay, then I won't. So yeah, he's selling the entire paper, not the little nugget that somebody might be looking for. But as anybody who's ever played around with old newspapers or magazines, part of what you want to see is the context. And were his readers looking for that? We don't know. No, I mean, they aren't talking about it. They usually are talking about finding an article. But in a sense, the veterans who were looking for Civil War battle news are also wanting to see what was going on. If they were on the battlefield, they have no idea what else was happening. If they're also looking at other news of what was going on in the war at that time. Ulysses S. Grant, what was he looking for? Maybe just about his own concerns, maybe other things. I mean, we just have these little tantalizing snippets of how people were using his papers. And back to that, Zach's question about the value of things rising, he also sold dime novels, that sort of went through several cycles of popularity. They were becoming collector's items, though, at some point along in there. They go from being just trash that are corrupting youth to being sort of interesting nostalgia pieces. And he's got them listed in all of his items. The other thing he makes a point of saying that people come in to buy, they start to read a serialized novel in the middle, and then they have to go back and buy the earlier installments. So there, maybe they just want the snippet, but they also may be interested in the rest. And yeah, the clipping becomes much more of a sort of element that moves around. And the clipping bureaus are really, I mean, they start barely in the 80s, take off in the 90s and into the 20th century, but they really become they become huge. They're still running very strong in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's only with the digitization that they start. And I think there's some still advertising that they exist, but for the most part, Reddit takes care of some of these things, or, of the daily news.
And what's the history of those vertical files, Laura? I don't know.
1890s invention
Okay.
here.
I mean, once the
File cabinet, yeah.
then libraries start making clipping files or vertical files.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
sorts of things. We sometimes call them subject files, but that's a post-filing cabinet library invention, and then it becomes commonplace. So you could walk into your library, you can look, every local library would have them and say, I'm looking for the articles on this.
Right.
It's a different kind of search function than what people do.
Laura was just saying that vertical files are an innovation of the 1890s, and then they've become enormously popular in libraries, which collect materials that they keep in the vertical files, and you could ask for in the library. So again, librarians are sort of serving the clipping collector, the clipping service function there.
Cassidy.
Thank you so much. It's a really great talk. I was actually wondering a follow-up question, something you mentioned about how, as you were sort of noting, even if you only had one issue left, a newspaper, it might be worth keeping around reference. And I was wondering if you have any hints how willing he was to sell, if he probably sold, like if he only had one copy of a newspaper on one day, he was going to like to sell that, or just try to, offer this reference. And part of this thing that seems interesting too is like, as we're saying, the kind of like surge pricing metaphor, like he was probably making more money on the days that were like historically significant, or we're getting demand and stuff. So I'm just wondering if you have any sense of what were happening to newspapers on days that were like not historically significant, and if he's willing to sell his last copy.
I really don't have that. So the question was, would he sell his last copy of a day that wasn't particularly significant? And what the sort of one issue left problem?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, he doesn't discuss that. He does say, I'm very aware when I'm down to just one, I try to buy new ones, or I reprint it. So again, this notion of reprinting, what is he reprinting exactly? And I've never seen any of these. And, I haven't seen any of his collection, in fact, because it burned up, and after it. So in around 1931 or 32, he was in ill health. He went into, so shortly after that 1931 article, 32, he goes off to Ward's Island, where he dies in 1933 of heart disease. And there's yet another article about him in 1935, a very lazy reporter rerunning his old thing saying he's just been to see, he's often, he doesn't, or the Sun lied and said he was still alive. I don't know. But that, the question of the last number, I have no idea. I mean, the whole thing, I've tried to learn more about what might have happened to his collection. Did it get sold? The Sun was a devotee of dime novels, so you would think he would have cared about that and sold it, but or done something with it, whatever was left of that.
He didn't make any note on the newspapers. I mean, he does put his name on a lot. But
Right.
He didn't log in that he got a newspaper.
Oh, that's an interesting
I mean, you might
point.
find it in
That
a
way we would
library
not-
collection or something with his mark or price. code
Yeah.
even.
No, I mean, what he says is in 1895, he was able to get in and roll a barrel of correspondence out in time before the fire got to it. And that allowed him to buy more of a collection back again so he could restock. But in 1922, he was not able to do that.
Kind of a technical question. I know I spent a lot of time in the New York Historical Society looking through old newspapers, and there's a point in which the rags turned to paper, right? And the rags were much better preserved than when they turned.
You mean to wood pulp paper?
Right,
Yeah.
right. Did that change the way he stored or sold papers once there was that? Because his career did see a change from pulp, the rags to wood pulp.
You know, my sense, and this is not really from Bud, but from looking at lots of scrapbooks from that period, is that if you got a fresh piece of paper, if you got the day's newspaper and you clipped it for your scrapbook, you were not aware that it was particularly different paper. It's later that you turn the page and it falls apart, that becomes obvious. I don't think, and you know, at least according to Nicholson Baker, you know, the nicely bound newspapers don't fall apart. But you know, I don't know, you know, we have newspapers today that are made of wood pulp paper. It's a somewhat different process, but they seem pretty sturdy the day we get them, you know, so it takes a while for them to
And
really.
it's not a one of those this year A, next year B. It really is much more uneven and depending on papers and place and gradual shortages of rags. And I think, I don't know if Jim is still on the call, but Jim Green, but I have from Jim that this is a lot of gray area in terms of paper content and over time. Lynn?
I have a question. This was wonderful. Did you say something about people reading some of the papers at this place or, okay. And were they, do you have a sense of whether they were charged to read? Okay.
Yep, I don't know how much. He doesn't say that. No, that was something that newspaper reporters would come by and do. And that probably, you know, as the Herald and the Tribune moved up there, he probably had more business from that. But then he lost that when he had to lose, you know, when he completely collapsed into his Vernon Avenue, Ravenswood area place. Yeah, Peter.
I got the impression that he created lists of the publications that he
Yes.
had, because even if we take him at face value that he had 6 million items, there were lots of duplicates, and I don't know who could estimate how many papers he didn't have. It was in tens of millions.
Yeah.
So did he inform his customers, I have this and this? I saw a glimpse of that. I have Nation, I have Bigger Times.
Yeah, in the American.
Something like
In-
that.
In the booklet so the question is, did he keep lists of the papers that he had, or did he show them to in that booklet that he made in 1889, he lists lots of papers, though it can't possibly be an exhaustive list, given the numbers he says he has. But he must have kept some kind of list in the front, but he also had an extraordinary memory. And so people would come in and he would say, yeah, I have that.
But he must have had some kind of book for himself, because he's asking for very specific numbers of papers that he's
Right.
lacking. So.
Yeah, he must have
may
kept some kind of,
But he must have had some.
I would love to see it, but
Well, and I guess
Yeah.
Peter's question is also implying that there should be, you've got some correspondence with American Antiquarian Society, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
But this notion of, letter writing, here's what I'm looking for.
and you could also see, I mean, I don't know if you read read what he wrote there. He had a couple of years of schooling at most.
Yeah.
So he read very well, obviously, but his writing is not something that would impress a librarian or, anybody who was of a high, of a higher class. So that's, also has an impact on how people saw him. There was something that was a little better written. I wondered if that was one of his children doing it. But it wasn't, sometimes he's writing with a pencil, sometimes with a pen. It's hard to see.
It's not that long ago, 2033.
Three.
He has 4 children. Have you tried to? find
Yes, I have found the children through Reginald Pitt, who is a remarkable genealogist and an archivist and all sorts of wonderful historical things. I don't know how he tracked this down, but he did. And I got to meet some of his descendants. And they did not know anything about him. One of the sons, they remembered their uncle Robert Jr., the motorcycle rider, who would occasionally, the oldest of them remembered him, sort of zooming in and out now and then. And then I guess it was the grandfather of one of them, always said it was important to save newspapers. And I think that was, now I've got it, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering it right. But basically, he had Bagnummer Bud was not a really nice man. He beat his wife. He, or was accused of that. And his wife left with one of the children for Western Massachusetts, where the son became a prominent police officer with a community center named after him. And then his son is the one that I've corresponded with, and another member of that generation I met with some of the others. And I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the names right, and I don't see any of them on the call, unfortunately. You've got somebody entering the waiting room. So, yeah, I mean, it does not sound like they had an easy life with this world. Oh, one thing I did learn from them was another celebrity visitor who does not show up in the news accounts. Booker T. Washington came to the warehouse and offered to send one of the sons to Tuskegee, and the kid went and hid. He really didn't want that. So interesting other possibilities there. I don't know more. I mean, yeah.
I wondered if I could just sort of raise there's so many questions and thoughts I have, but maybe a more general one for your thoughts on this. Last week, and I know not everybody in this room or on Zoom was present for last week, we were talking about the problem of scarcity and loss. And Andrew Pettigrew raised the point that it isn't actually a problem of time. We've lost as much, he argued, from the 19th century as we have from the 16th century. And this is sort of an abstract question that you can respond however you want. I mean, I'm interested in his sort of origin story, the way you told it in the war, Civil War, and, veterans sort of, and a culture of memory. I'm thinking of sort of Drew Faust's work on mourning and memory. And I'm just wondering, it seems like this remarkable character is somehow a product of a culture of loss
Mm,
and sort of responding to a kind of notion of scarcity and memory, even if those around him are not understanding what he's doing. I don't know. I'm just fumbling around of
I love that.
his his kind of curious place in a world of disappearing thing, mass production and disappearance all at the same time.
I'm going to steal that next time I do some more writing on this. No, I think that's right. Yes. I mean, the Civil War is a time when newspapers really take off. Newspaper reading just becomes essential for everyone. There's that wonderful line from Justice, help me out. Oliver Wendell Holmes says, or not the Justice, the other one, Junior says, I'm called out to read newspapers by the divine right of the, I'm called out of the house by divine right of newspapers to just go find out what the news is. Everybody was desperate to know what was happening, at home, they're mostly reading to see who survived and who's killed and what the lists of killed and wounded are. They really, if they have friends on the battlefield, they have to know that. So that's interesting that it's that mode, but he's selling to the people actually on the battlefield.
Yeah.
But they also have probably have no other way of knowing whether, more laterally what's going on another battlefield or, around the corner in camp. So it's another.
Very limited experience with those old newspapers leads me to think that a lot of those folks were rushing to newspaper for one reason only. The list
Yeah,
of the dead and missing.
right.
Every day. Some of those papers I've seen, the list just, we want what we lose, 750,000 dead.
Yeah.
In 4 years.
Right. But they're also going for the headlines. Did we lose or win? I mean, you see that in Melville's, what's the big, great poem that has that wonderful newspaper reading scene. Everybody's here, they go out to look at the sheets that are posted up and they want to see what the news is. And then they get it read, it's read aloud to them there, and then they buy copies so they can read it privately. And it's not the lists that are read aloud, it's the more overall, but of course it's the lists they need to see. Yeah, it's a story of loss. But it's also a story of abundance of newspaper, of people desperate to hang on to that, to see it. And that's also when scrapbook making takes off in a big way, because people they have such an intense emotional relationship to the newspaper that they want to save that news, what moved them in their scrapbooks.
Related to that, did he advertise like 20th anniversary of an event or like today?
Yeah.
he will collect
The Times still does this, right? The paper
Right.
your birthday.
20th anniversary
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Diana's death or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Did he do that and
No.
give a sense about whether people came in and said, do you have a paper on my birthday or my anniversary or?
I think he sort of implies that people, so the question is, does back number Bud advertise, you can get,
I mean, Lincoln's assassination would be the key one paper, right?
Right.
Still the most precious paper in American
Is it?
history.
it's
Thanks.
actually endlessly cut up in scrapbooks. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
the sort of ending moment for many Northern scrapbooks,
Oh, wow.
the sort of mourning
Yeah, yeah.
of Lincoln. But he did advertise it in a different way. He put things, I have not seen a picture of his storefront, but there's a description a couple of times so he had a long staircase going down to the basement where he actually had his establishment. But that he, at least in some of the locations, he had the use of a board or a window to put something up, to put up a particular newspaper that was relevant, perhaps historically. I mean, he probably did think about anniversaries for that, but the reporters don't mention it. So, and I don't have a diary from him.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
have, that's the thing. Here's somebody who did not write about his work.
Well, I wonder too, I was just saying, you see advertising places where you can buy a newspaper from a particular date to give it a gift or things like that. So there's still some kind of market for that kind of thing. And so there has to be some way of they're also organizing. all that,
Yeah, nowadays, yeah,
You know,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
yeah.
So the idea that you buy a newspaper from a particular date, your anniversary, your birthday, whatever. So people, the dealers that sell that actual, that do sell those, yeah, they have to organize it somehow. And presumably they run out of copies of
Right.
particular.
Well, I think the cost depends upon the date and things like that, so it may not be so far away.
Yeah, the cost depends on the, somebody's writing something about this. I don't know. Follow up, I see. Somebody,
Oh,
What?
just transcribe,
oh, you
yeah.
were saying that. Okay. So, yeah, he does mention, there's a kind of funny thing where he talks about how he can read his customers to know what they'll pay. Because his prices are pretty flexible. I mean, he does have this set, it goes up a certain amount per month, but then sky is the limit if you really want it, and that's the only one. But he says he can't read the women customers the same way. He doesn't know why they're coming in the same way. So
Oh.
I don't know if that's because they're coming for, a birthday issue, or if or something for a gift, or what it is. Or they're, he doesn't enlarge on that. But that's a question. And the thing is that the reporters who are writing about him are interested in the stuff that touches them the most. So they like the parts where other reporters are looking. They like the parts where people are really engaged with the newspaper. They're less interested in somebody comes in for their birthday. I mean, they don't say that. And I think it's very likely that people did, but it's not something that would touch them. Again, just the same, they do mention in a sort of shadowy way that people are reading dime novels in the back,
Hmm.
but they don't care about
Nobody
that.
cares,
It's
yeah.
not about them.
Yeah, I mean, the place, it's almost a library-like, it's a library-like place, maybe more than, yeah.
If you can read in a
be
a
like-
gaslit cellar,
Yeah,
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 it's a
yeah.
library-like place.
Yeah. Well, this is amazing. You have proved beyond the shadow of doubt that Backnumber Bud is a historian and an archivist and a librarian and an amazing figure, and we look forward to learning more about him as you do. So thank you, Ellen.
Well, thank you all. Really wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Zoomers, and we will see everybody in a few weeks. Have a good holiday season.